Good evening and welcome, dear friends, to Hidden Clue. I'm so glad you've joined me tonight, here in the quiet charm of St. Mary Mead. The fire crackles softly, lanterns glow through the mist, and the gentle autumn breeze carries the scent of falling leaves. Wherever you are listening from tonight, I hope you're settled in with a warm cup of tea, ready to step into a story full of mystery, curiosity and gentle suspense. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Share it in the comments below, and if you enjoy cozy mysteries that warm the heart while tickling your curiosity, don't forget to like and subscribe. Chapter 1. Morning After the Scream. Under a soft veil of mist, St. Mary Mead awoke to whispers. The sun had barely risen, yet the bakery door swung open and shut like a pendulum, drawing in villagers with flour on their sleeves and questions on their tongues. Mrs. Partridge, who always came for her morning loaf, leaned toward the counter as if confiding a state secret. "They say it was at the manor," she murmured. A dreadful scream in the night, and now poor Mr. Thomas Hewitt gone. The baker's wife nodded gravely, though her eyes shone with curiosity. "The constable came by just after dawn," she said. "Found him in the library." "Dead," they said, though no one knows how. The words lingered like smoke, curling out the open door and into the crisp October air. Children chasing each other on the green paused to stare toward the hill where Hewitt Manor loomed, its windows shuttered tight against the morning light. Miss Marple, passing by with her basket, seemed as placid as ever. She offered a polite nod to the baker's wife, who lowered her voice in respect, or perhaps in reverence for someone known to notice things. Miss Marple merely smiled. She had long learned that in villages, truth often arrived half-baked, but fully seasoned with imagination. Still, the unease in the air could not be mistaken. A short walk up the lane brought her to Hewitt Manor, a grand stone house that had once echoed with laughter during the summer fetes. Now it stood still, wrapped in the uneasy quiet that follows tragedy. A uniformed constable stood at the gate, hat in hand, as if hoping the house might explain itself. When Miss Marple approached, he straightened, clearly torn between duty and politeness. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "Best not go troubling them today. The family's in a state." "I quite understand, Constable Graves," she said, gently, her tone the sort one uses with anxious children. "But I've brought flowers for poor Mrs. Hewitt. White chrysanthemums. She always said they reminded her of her wedding bouquet. It would seem unkind not to deliver them personally, don't you think?" He hesitated. Few could say no to Miss Marple when she spoke in that soft, reasonable way. Finally, he stepped aside, muttering something about how kindness was always proper. The front door opened to a heavy silence. A maid, eyes red, apron rumpled, led her into the hall, where the air smelled faintly of wood polish and yesterday's fear. Miss Marple's gaze swept the corridor as naturally as one might glance at a garden hedge. Nothing dramatic, nothing hurried, just quiet observation. She noticed the umbrella stand had been moved slightly off-center, and a trail of faint scuff marks led toward the library. When the door opened, a hush met her, thick as dust. The library was vast, lined with shelves that seemed to close in around the fireplace where the tragedy had occurred. The curtains were drawn, but a single line of sunlight fell across the rug, revealing a pattern of footprints blurred by many others. Mrs. Hewitt sat in an armchair, her posture rigid. A cup of untouched tea trembled in her hand. "I thank you for coming, Jane," she said faintly. "It's all too dreadful." Miss Marple set down the flowers on a nearby table. "My dear, words fail one at times like these." "I shan't intrude, but if I might sit a moment." The widow nodded, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief that smelled of lavender. The constable stood near the hearth, making notes in his small book. On the mantel, a candle had been moved just enough to reveal a ring of clean wood beneath it, a tiny patch where dust had not yet settled. Curious, Miss Marple's eyes flicked across the room. A decanter on the sideboard caught the light, but there was dust on the neck and a faint outline where another glass might have rested. I suppose poor Mr. Hewitt was alone when it happened, she asked softly. The constable frowned. Seems so. They say he was reading by the fire. Heart failure, perhaps, though the doctor isn't certain. Miss Marple murmured. Her gaze lingered on the rug near the writing desk. One glove lay there, pale and delicate, the sort worn by ladies on Sunday. Odd, then, that it should be found beside the chair of a man who never cared for company. She stooped, pretending to adjust her shawl, and glanced more closely. The glove was dusted with a faint grey mark along the fingers, as though it had brushed against stone, or perhaps metal. She straightened and looked toward the window, noting that one pane bore a thin streak of condensation, as though it had been briefly opened during the night. Mrs. Hewitt spoke again, her voice brittle. The doctor says it was natural causes. I want to believe that. Miss Marple nodded kindly. Of course, my dear. It's comforting when life and nature agree. Yet inside she was certain they did not. Nature did not leave gloves by library chairs, nor did heart failure move candles or leave decanters askew. Outside, the church bells began to toll the hour, their sound carrying across the village like a slow heartbeat. Miss Marple rose, offering her condolences once more. But as she stepped back into the cool air, her mind hummed with quiet certainty. In a tidy room, it's the untidy thing that tells the truth, and somewhere within those small disturbances, the glove, the candle, the dust, lay the story of what truly happened at Hewitt Manor last night. The drawing-room of Hewitt Manor had always been a place of laughter and mild gossip, its rose-coloured curtains catching the morning light, its piano forever slightly out of tune. But today it felt like a stage set for tragedy, everything too quiet, too careful, as though grief itself had been rehearsed. Miss Marple sat discreetly at the edge of the room, her hands folded over her handbag, observing without appearing to do so. The Hewitt family had gathered in a half-circle near the fire, Mrs. Hewitt, pale and trembling, her daughters Clara and Margaret, and at a slight distance their cousin Harold, who had arrived from London upon hearing the dreadful news. No one spoke for several moments. Only the slow tick of the mantel clock filled the silence. Then Clara, the elder daughter, straightened in her chair. "Mother, you mustn't let yourself fall to pieces," she said crisply, her voice betraying more impatience than comfort. It was bound to happen sooner or later. Tom never did take care of himself. Mrs. Hewitt flinched at the words, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth. "That's a dreadful thing to say, Clara." Her tone was gentle, yet her eyes flashed briefly toward her sister, a spark of resentment. Or was it guilt? Miss Marple noticed, as she often did, how people revealed themselves most when they believed they were behaving well. Cousin Harold cleared his throat. "We must remember," he began solemnly, "that the constable believes it was a heart seizure. There's no need to upset ourselves with fancies." His voice was firm, but his gaze darted nervously to the door, as though he half expected someone to contradict him. Miss Marple smiled politely. "Quite so," she said. "And yet, in my experience, fancies are sometimes the first cousins of facts." Her remark was met with a polite stiffness. Families in mourning did not appreciate being reminded that truth might not be tidy. Clara turned sharply toward her. "You've known Mother for years, Miss Marple. Surely you don't think there's anything untoward?" "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple said mildly, "I think life is generally untoward. But we make do." The clock chimed again, and everyone seemed to breathe out at once. A maid entered with a tray of tea, her hands shaking so badly that the cups rattled. "Forgive me, ma'am," she stammered. Well, it's all been such a shock." Mrs. Hewitt nodded weakly. Yes, poor Mary. We're all unsettled." Then she looked around, suddenly alert. "Where is Evans?" He should have seen to the fire by now. "The butler?" Clara frowned. "He's not been seen since last night. Perhaps he's with the constable." "No," said the maid quietly. "The constable was asking after him this morning. No one's seen him since supper." A small ripple of silence moved through the room. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, studying their faces, the flicker of surprise, the tightening of Clara's jaw, the way Margaret's hands clasped one another too tightly in her lap. Only Mrs. Hewitt looked genuinely bewildered. "How odd," she murmured. "He's been with us for nearly 20 years. Evans would never leave without word. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but clear. People rarely vanish without leaving some trace, Mrs. Hewitt. One just has to know where to look for it. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. Please, Miss Marple, must we speak of such things? Her voice trembled on the edge of tears. Can't we just remember Tom kindly for one? Her mother reached out and patted her hand. You're right, dear. Then, almost absently, she added, Tom was never meant to inherit. Not really. The words hung in the air like a chill draught. Clara turned sharply. Mother, don't start that again. But Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with quiet interest. Never meant to inherit. It was an odd phrase, almost careless, one that revealed more than intended. She watched as Margaret looked down quickly at her lap, while Harold shifted in his chair, pretending not to hear. The conversation stumbled on, moving from condolences to practicalities, but something in the room had changed. Beneath the polite sorrow, a tension hummed, a delicate, dangerous thread stretched between them all. Miss Marple could feel it, the way one senses a storm long before the first rumble. When she finally rose to leave, Mrs. Hewitt pressed her hand. You've always been such a comfort, Jane, she said weakly. Miss Marple smiled kindly. You're very good to say so. Grief can be a most peculiar visitor. It rarely comes alone. Outside the air was damp and cool, the fog beginning to lift from the gardens. As she walked down the drive, Miss Marple looked back once at the tall windows of the drawing-room. Inside, the family still sat close together, like actors frozen at the end of a scene. Grief and guilt, she murmured to herself, often sit in the same chair. And somewhere within that sorrowful household, she felt certain, one of those chairs was already occupied by something far darker than loss. Chapter 2. The Pumpkin Clue. The vicarage garden was a patchwork of late-blooming chrysanthemums and curling autumn leaves. The air carried that faint sweetness that comes when the season has turned, and all that remains of summer is memory. Miss Marple sat opposite the vicar's wife beneath a vine of dying roses, her teacup resting lightly in her hand. The morning had been full of chatter, the kind that sweeps through villages after tragedy, but here, in this quiet corner, the air seemed steadier. I can't imagine what the world is coming to, Mrs. Clement said, stirring her tea in agitated circles. Halloween mischief, they're calling it. But there's nothing mischievous about death, is there, Miss Marple? Not unless one's referring to the way it plays tricks on us all, Miss Marple replied, gently. Her eyes wandered toward the churchyard wall, where ivy climbed like an old secret. You mentioned mischief, my dear. What did you mean exactly? Mrs. Clement leaned forward, lowering her voice as though the wind itself might be listening. Well, it's the most peculiar thing. One of the boys helping Constable Graves told me they found a smashed pumpkin just under the library window at Hewitt Manor, carved apparently. A frightful little face. A pumpkin? Miss Marple asked mildly, though her mind was already whirring. That does seem rather out of place in mourning, don't you think? Oh, indeed, Mrs. Clement said, but it wasn't just that. They say inside it, inside the broken pieces, there were bits of something metallic. The constable thought perhaps a candle holder, but it's all quite strange, isn't it? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Strange things often point the way, if one bothers to look twice. She rose, brushing crumbs from her skirt. I do think I'll take a small walk, if you'll forgive me. 10 minutes later, she stood once again before Hewitt Manor. The constable, recognizing her, merely sighed and opened the gate. By now he knew resistance was futile. Back again, Miss Marple? He asked, though his tone held no annoyance, only weary respect. I thought perhaps a bit of air might help me think, she said, and the air near a mystery always seems freshest. The lawn was still damp with morning dew. As she approached the library window, she saw the remains of the pumpkin, jagged orange shards scattered like the aftermath of a child's game gone wrong. Kneeling carefully, she examined one large piece. It was carved with the crudest of faces, triangular eyes, and a grin that looked more grimace than smile. A few candle drips clung to the inside, hardened and pale. But there, near the bottom edge, glimmered something faintly metallic, a small trace, almost invisible unless the light caught it just so. She touched it gently with her gloved fingertip.
"Not candle wax," she murmured. "Something harder. A flake of tin, perhaps." "Tin?"
Constable Graves echoed, frowning. "Maybe part of a holder, like Mrs. Hewitt said. Or a bit of lantern." "Possibly," Miss Marple said, straightening. "But pumpkins don't break themselves, do they?" He scratched his chin. "Could have been dropped." "Wind last night was fierce." But the wind doesn't like candles," she said softly. Her eyes followed the line of the windowsill. There, against the dark stone, were faint streaks, wax drips, thin but unmistakable, trailing downward, leading toward the flower bed. She bent closer. The petals of a few late dahlias were slightly singed at the tips, as though something hot had been knocked against them. "It seems," she murmured,
"that someone used the pumpkin for more than decoration." The constable looked uneasy.
"What do you think it means?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "That depends on what one means by used. A pumpkin, a candle, and a bit of metal. Those together could light a path, or conceal one." He blinked at her in confusion, but she only smiled.
"Tell me, did anyone in the house admit to carving it?"
Mrs. Hewitt said her daughters arranged some decorations for the fete, but she didn't recall any pumpkins at the manor. Said they'd given them all to the children's party at the hall. "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. She walked a few steps away, then turned, studying the window from a distance. "Strange that one should find its way back here, don't you think?"
"Almost as though someone wanted to bring the celebration closer to home." The constable shrugged helplessly.
"Maybe just village pranksters." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But pranksters rarely bring metal into their jokes." She glanced once more at the wax trail. It led not toward the gate, but around the side of the house, where the path curved out of sight. There was a faint scuff of mud there, a single partial footprint, the sole of a boot with a narrow heel. Not a man's work boot, she noted, but something more refined. "Would you mind terribly," she asked, "if I had a look inside once more? I promise not to disturb your fine police work." The constable sighed. "You always promise that, Miss Marple. Trouble is, you usually do find something worth disturbing." She gave a modest smile. "Only when something wishes very much not to be found." Inside the library, the air was heavier than before, faintly scented with smoke and old polish. The window stood exactly as it had that morning, locked, yet with a faint smear along the latch where fingers had recently touched. Miss Marple traced it gently. "Someone opened this window," she said. "From the inside, I think. To place something outside, or to retrieve it later." She turned toward the constable.
"And if that's the case, my dear Graves, then this little pumpkin wasn't merely decoration.
It was part of someone's plan." Outside, the church bell tolled noon, long and solemn. Miss Marple glanced once more at the orange fragments lying in the grass. "Even pumpkins," she said softly, almost to herself, "can keep secrets if one looks closely enough." The Blue Hart Inn sat at the bend of the main road, where chimney smoke curled lazily into the grey October air. It was the sort of place that seemed to hum quietly with its own rhythm, mugs clinking, chairs creaking, and the low murmur of conversation weaving through the scent of ale and wood polish. Miss Marple entered with her usual air of gentle purpose, as though she were simply seeking warmth on a cool morning. Few ever suspected that beneath her kind smile lay the sharpest mind in the village. She chose a table near the fire, not too close to the regulars, yet not so distant as to appear aloof. From there, she could listen without seeming to listen. The innkeeper, Mrs. Phelps, greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Tea, I expect?"
"Thank you, my dear."
"And perhaps one of those currant scones, if it's not too much trouble." Mrs. Phelps beamed. "Never any trouble for you. Terrible business up at the manor, isn't it?" "The poor family?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, stirring her tea.
"Such a dreadful shock."
"Though shocks, I've found, rarely come from nowhere." Mrs. Phelps gave her a curious look, but before she could reply, the inn door creaked open. In came two men, the gardener from Hewitt Manor, a burly fellow named Bill Hodges, and a travelling salesman in a worn grey coat. They took stools at the bar, ordering ale, their voices carrying easily in the low-beamed room. "I tell you," the gardener was saying, There was a quarrel at the manor that very afternoon. Heard it plain as day when I was trimming the hedge near the terrace. The salesman chuckled. Families, eh? Always something behind those fine curtains, Hodges grunted. This weren't just something. Mr. Thomas and his brother George were going at it. Quiet-like, but fierce. Couldn't make out all the words, but I caught inheritance and unfair. Then Mrs. Hewitt came out and told me to take the rest of the day off. That's when I knew something wasn't right. Miss Marple sipped her tea, eyes lowered, as though studying the reflection in her cup. Quarrels before death were rarely coincidence. The salesman leaned an elbow on the counter. I passed the manor that night myself. I was on my way to the station, bit late for the train. The moon was bright enough, though, and I saw someone by the back gate, looked like a woman, wearing one of those long, dark cloaks the young ladies favour these days. Hodges frowned. Back gate? That's near the old orchard. Aye. Thought she might be out for air till I realised it was close to midnight. He paused, rubbing his chin. Funny thing is, when the light hit her cloak, I could have sworn it had that little silver clasp. Same sort I saw on one of the Hewitt girls at the fete last week. Hodges' brows rose. Miss Clara or Miss Edith?
Couldn't tell, said the salesman. Too dark.
But I know what I saw. Mrs. Phelps clucked her tongue. You gentlemen oughtn't gossip about a tragedy. Poor things have enough to bear. Oh, we're not gossiping, Hodges said, lowering his voice, though the words still carried. Just saying it's queer, that's all. And if you ask me, that family's got more secrets than the churchyard at midnight. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. She finished her tea and folded her napkin neatly, eyes drifting toward the window where faint, muddy prints trailed just outside the door, fresh enough to gleam in the light. When she rose to leave, Mrs. Phelps hurried to fetch her coat. You'll be careful walking back, Miss Marple. Roads are slippery. Oh, I always tread carefully, Miss Marple said with a kind smile. It's surprising what one can notice when one's not in a hurry. As she stepped outside, the autumn wind caught the edge of her scarf. She paused a moment, looking down at the muddy prints again, broad, uneven, the sort left by work boots. But there was another set crossing them, smaller and neater, heading in the opposite direction. They led from the lane toward the manor path, faint but distinct. She followed them with her gaze until they vanished near the bend. Sometimes, she murmured to herself, truth walks right past you in muddy boots. The question is who was wearing them. The village clock struck 2. The sound rolled across the rooftops, fading into the stillness of the countryside. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her eyes thoughtful. Pieces were falling quietly into place, pumpkins, quarrels, cloaks, and footprints. Each clue, ordinary on its own, was beginning to hum together like notes in a familiar song. She turned back toward the road, her step unhurried but sure. In her mind, the picture of that night was no longer blurred. It was only waiting for one more detail, one more truth to bring it into perfect focus. Chapter 3. Old Wounds Resurface. The Hewitt home, usually a place of polished calm, felt heavier that afternoon. Thick, velvet drapes were drawn halfway against the pale October light, giving the drawing-room the look of a portrait hung too long in shadow. Miss Marple sat in one of the smaller armchairs, her knitting resting quietly on her lap. Around her the family gathered, each person perfectly polite, perfectly composed, yet straining against some unseen weight. Clara Hewitt, the eldest, stood by the mantelpiece. She was tall, elegant, and controlled, every gesture deliberate, as though emotion was something she could manage by schedule.
Brother was impossible, she said at last.
You may as well know it, Miss Marple. He quarrelled with everyone, even the servants. I suppose it was inevitable that one day his temper would get the better of him. Her tone was clipped, almost weary. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that exhaustion often hides guilt or fear. She said nothing, only nodded gently, as though in sympathy. Across the room, Margaret Hewitt sat near the window, hands folded tightly in her lap. She was younger than Clara by several years, softer in manner, her eyes pale and watchful. She had barely spoken since Miss Marple arrived, though once or twice her gaze flickered toward her sister before dropping again. Mrs. Hewitt, seated on the sofa with a lace handkerchief clutched in one hand, sighed. "You must understand, Miss Marple, we are all quite shattered. Poor Thomas may not have been easy, but he was my son." "Of course," Miss Marple said kindly. "Grief is never tidy, is it? It leaves such odd corners." Mrs. Hewitt dabbed at her eyes, but said nothing more. A clock chimed softly from the hall, and in the silence that followed, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander over the polished sideboard, the faint dust on a photograph frame, the empty space on the wall where a portrait had clearly hung once before being removed. Houses, she thought, tell their stories even when people will not. Clara spoke again, her voice suddenly sharper. "If only Father hadn't changed his will, none of this would have happened." "Changed it?" Miss Marple asked mildly, though her eyes did not lift from her knitting. "Yes," Clara said. "Just last month. After all these years of keeping everything divided neatly between us, he decided to leave the house, and most of the estate, to Thomas."
Said it was for the good of the family, as though any of us believed that not. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came.
Her hand trembled slightly against her skirt. Mrs. Hewitt sighed again, lower this time. "Your father was never easy to reason with, my dear. He said Tom had a head for business."
"I thought it unwise, but one doesn't argue with the dead." Miss Marple glanced up briefly, catching the flicker that passed across Margaret's face, something like anguish, quickly hidden.
"Wills," she said softly, "can bring out the strangest shades in people. But I've found that true unhappiness seldom begins with money."
"It usually begins much earlier." For a moment no one spoke.
Then Clara laughed, brittle and humourless. "You sound like our old governess, Miss Marple. She used to say that resentment runs in the blood like freckles." "Perhaps she was right. Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently. "Or perhaps resentment is simply something that grows when kindness is left too long untended." She noticed how Margaret's eyes glistened then, though she turned quickly to face the window. Outside, the garden gleamed wetly from last night's rain, its gravel paths blurred by fallen leaves. A gardener moved slowly among the hedges, his figure distorted by the glass. There was history here, old, heavy, and unfinished. The kind of history that didn't fade when time passed, only settled deeper. "I do hope," Miss Marple said after a quiet pause, "that you'll allow yourselves to rest. The constable will want more statements soon, I expect."
"These things can be so tiring." Clara lifted her chin.
"We've nothing to hide, Miss Marple." "Of course not," she said, smiling faintly. "It's just that truth, in my experience, can be rather shy. Sometimes it hides behind the loudest words." She gathered her knitting and rose to leave. At the doorway, she paused. "Your brother must have had many qualities that people overlooked. Would you say he had friends?" Clara gave a small dismissive shrug. "Not many. He was too proud. Too much like father." But Margaret's voice came, quiet and strained. "He wasn't always like that." Everyone turned to look at her. She flushed under their gaze. "When we were children," she said softly, "Tom used to make up stories for us. He'd act them out with the garden scarecrow." "I hadn't thought of that in years." Mrs. Hewitt looked startled, and Clara gave a small, impatient sigh. But Miss Marple only nodded. "Stories," she said, "have a way of staying with us."
"Especially the ones we don't finish." As she stepped out into the cool afternoon, the air smelled faintly of damp earth and chrysanthemum.
From somewhere in the distance came the faint toll of the church bell. She drew her shawl a little tighter around her shoulders, her mind turning over what she had seen, the missing portrait, the changed will, and the way Clara's eyes hardened whenever her sister spoke. Yes, Miss Marple thought, the dead do whisper through the living, if one knows how to listen. And in this house, the whispers were growing louder by the hour. The disappearance of Mr. Evans came to the village the way all news did, carried on the soft wind of gossip, reaching every doorstep before noon. By the time Miss Marple arrived at the manor the next morning, the constable's bicycle already leaned against the gatepost, and the air was full of uneasy talk. The butler, it seemed, had vanished without so much as a farewell or a trace. Inside, the household was in a delicate state of disorder. A few drawers had been opened, a cupboard stood ajar, and Mrs. Hewitt's voice carried faintly from the hall.
"I knew it. I always said he was too quiet to be trusted." Constable Peck, notebook in hand, looked faintly embarrassed. "We found the pantry door unlatched, ma'am."
"Seems Mr. Evans left in the night. The silver's missing too. Looks to me like a clean getaway." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly as she entered. "Good morning, Constable. You seem quite sure of yourself." Peck nodded, though not with much conviction.
"It fits, doesn't it, ma'am? Missing butler, missing silver."
"Straightforward enough. Life," Miss Marple said gently, "is very rarely straightforward. People, even less so." Mrs. Hewitt clasped her hands together. "He'd been with us nearly 20 years, Miss Marple."
"I never thought he'd turn out to be a thief." Miss Marple studied the room with care.
The breakfast table had been cleared but not properly wiped. A faint ring of tea remained on the cloth. A dishcloth hung unevenly over the rail, and beside it, on the small side table, lay a thin black book, a Bible, its cover worn smooth by many years of use.
She moved toward it. "Is this Mr. Evans's?" she asked. "Yes," Mrs. Hewitt said, frowning.
"He never went anywhere without it."
"Used to read a passage each morning before the fire was lit." Miss Marple opened it gently, and a small pressed violet slipped out, brittle with age.
The pages fell open to a marked passage. She read softly under her breath, "For nothing is secret that shall not be made manifest, neither anything hid that shall not be known and come abroad." She closed the book thoughtfully. "Curious," she murmured. "Men who steal seldom leave behind the things that give them comfort." Constable Peck shifted uneasily. "You think he didn't run then?"
"I think," she said, turning the Bible over in her hand, "that Mr. Evans may have gone nowhere at all, or that he went only because he felt he must." Mrs. Hewitt blinked, bewildered.
"But where could he be? Surely someone would have seen him." Miss Marple walked to the window. The garden stretched out, glistening faintly with dew. "There are many ways to leave a house, Mrs. Hewitt, and not all of them require a road. Tell me, was there anything particular that troubled him recently?" Mrs. Hewitt hesitated. "He seemed quieter than usual. After Mr. Thomas's death, I found him standing outside the library one evening, just looking at the door. When I asked if he was unwell, he said only, 'The truth will out, ma'am,' and went back to his duties." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "And did he ever quarrel with your son?" "Never." "Mr. Evans was loyal to a fault," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, loyalty can be quite a burden, especially when it's divided," Peck frowned. "So what do you think happened then?" She turned toward him, her eyes mild. "I think we should look not for what Mr. Evans took, but for what he left behind. Thieves do not usually mark their exits with scripture." The constable glanced at the Bible again, his brows drawing together.
"You think he's been silenced, ma'am?"
"I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that a servant's silence can speak volumes, and sometimes it says, 'I've seen something I shouldn't have.'" Mrs. Hewitt gave a small gasp.
"You don't mean he knew something about Tom's death?"
Miss Marple did not answer. She merely placed the Bible neatly back on the table, the violet pressed once more between its pages. Perhaps he did, or perhaps he only thought he did. Either way, truth is rarely convenient, and justice, well, justice has its own pace. Outside, a cold gust stirred the trees, scattering leaves across the gravel path. Somewhere, a shutter creaked softly, like a sigh. Miss Marple watched the movement of the branches, her thoughts already far ahead. Mr. Evans had not taken the silver, she felt certain of that.
No, he had taken something else.
Something far more dangerous, the knowledge of what really happened on that Halloween night. And if she was right, the house itself would soon begin to tell her where he'd gone. Chapter 4. Candlelight. Confessions. Evening settled gently over St. Mary Mead, draping the village in a soft hush of gold and grey. At the Hewitt Manor, only one room glowed, a small sitting-room off the hall where Mrs. Hewitt sat by the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea. The house was quieter now than it had ever been. The servants moved about in whispers, and even the ticking of the clock seemed to slow, as though time itself were listening. Miss Marple arrived at 7, shawl tucked neatly about her shoulders, her expression mild and unhurried. Mrs. Hewitt greeted her with a tired smile. "You're very kind to call, Miss Marple."
"It's been a difficult few days," of course said gently her gloves.
"Loss has a way of echoing, doesn't it? especially in houses like this. Mrs. Hewitt gestured toward the chair beside her.
Please do sit.
The evenings are so long now. The fire crackled, casting their faces in flickering orange light. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and waited, saying nothing. Silence, she knew, was an invitation most people couldn't resist. Mrs. Hewitt's eyes wandered to the mantel, where a photograph of her late husband stood beside one of her son.
You must think me foolish, she said.
So much sorrow, and yet I can't even bring myself to cry properly. There's no proper way to cry, Miss Marple said. Sometimes tears are simply too afraid to come. A faint, sad smile touched the widow's lips. You understand more than most, I think? Miss Marple only inclined her head. After a pause, Mrs. Hewitt's voice grew thinner, trembling at the edges.
Tom was going to ruin us all. The words hung there, fragile and terrible in the firelight.
Miss Marple said nothing, only watched the woman's hands twist the lace of her handkerchief. Mrs. Hewitt continued, almost in a whisper. He'd discovered things about his father's affairs, about the land and the debts. He wanted to sell the manor, can you believe it? Said it was time to be practical, that sentiment was for fools. I told him the house was the heart of our family, but he laughed. He said our family had no heart left. Her voice broke then, a thin, quiet sound that faded into the crackle of the fire. Miss Marple's eyes softened. And did anyone else know of his plans? I believe Clara did, Mrs. Hewitt said after a moment. She was furious when she found out. There were terrible words between them. Miss Marple nodded gently, her mind quietly weaving threads together. Families often carry their storms behind closed doors, but truth has a way of shining through rather like a candle in a dark room. Mrs. Hewitt's gaze lifted to her, uncertain.
You think one of us?
But she never finished. The door burst open suddenly, and Margaret stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with a trembling kind of courage. Mother, you mustn't say another word, she cried. Mrs. Hewitt started, half rising.
Margaret?
Whatever is the matter? Margaret's voice shook.
I heard you speaking. You're still protecting her. Protecting who?
Miss Marple asked gently, her tone mild as milk. Margaret turned, her breath unsteady. Clara, she said. It was Clara who quarrelled with Tom that night. She hated him. You know she did. Mrs. Hewitt's hand went to her throat.
Margaret, stop this. Your sister is... She's not what you think,
Margaret said, stepping closer to the firelight. Her face was blotched with tears she refused to shed. Tom found out something about Father's will. Something Clara did.
That's why she was afraid. That's why... But before she could go on, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor.
Clara herself appeared in the doorway, her expression cool, her eyes dark with fury. "Margaret," she said sharply, "how dare you?" The silence that followed was so deep that even the fire seemed to still. Margaret's voice trembled. "You can't keep pretending, Clara. It's too late for that." Clara took a slow step into the room, every line of her face taut with restraint. "You don't understand what you're saying." Miss Marple, seated quietly by the fire, watched the two women with the calm patience of someone who had seen many such storms before. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people speak the truth by accident, and sometimes they accuse others to keep from seeing themselves." Neither sister answered. The air between them was thick with something unspoken. Years of rivalry, of fear, of love turned sour. Mrs. Hewitt sank slowly into her chair, her face pale and drawn. At last Clara spoke, her voice low. "Margaret, you've always been too emotional. You let your imagination run away with you." Margaret's reply was almost a whisper. "And you've always hidden behind being sensible." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the fire again, the light flickering across her thoughtful face. Confession, she knew, was like a door that opened only when fear was ready to leave. Tonight, fear was still in the room, pacing softly, waiting for its turn. The clock struck 9, its chime echoing faintly through the house. Somewhere in the hall, a board creaked under a cautious step. Miss Marple looked toward the doorway, her mind turning over the widow's words, the sisters' quarrel, and the missing butler, whose silence now seemed less like absence and more like warning. Yes, she thought quietly, The truth is very near indeed. Morning broke pale and heavy over the Hewitt estate, the sort of morning when the mist seemed reluctant to lift. The manor, still reeling from its sleepless nights, greeted Constable Graves with the subdued tension of a place holding its breath. He arrived promptly at 9, boots polished, expression grave, and was shown into the drawing-room where Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting and a cup of tea. He cleared his throat. "I'm afraid there's been a new development, Miss Marple." "The late Mr. Hewitt's will, well, it's gone." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Gone, Constable?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, glancing toward Mrs. Hewitt, who sat pale and anxious on the sofa. "The solicitor came early this morning to collect the document for review, but the safe in the study was unlocked and empty. No sign of a break-in," Mrs. Hewitt's voice quavered.
"But that's impossible."
"My husband kept the key in his desk drawer. It was still there last I looked." Constable Graves frowned, flipping open his notebook. "We'll have to assume someone in the household had access." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes soft but intent.
"Curious thing, Constable."
"Only yesterday I noticed the empty frame above the library fireplace." "The frame?" "Yes," she said gently. "It once held a family charter, I believe, or so I was told. Now it holds nothing but a faint square of clean wood, untouched by dust." The constable blinked. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" She rose slowly, hands folded before her. "That the will was not stolen from the safe at all. It was destroyed. And whoever did it wanted the act mistaken for a disappearance." A faint sound escaped Mrs. Hewitt, part gasp, part moan. "Destroyed? But why?" Miss Marple's gaze wandered toward the hall, her mind already walking ahead of her words. "Because, dear lady, sometimes erasing a document is simpler than disputing it."
"Especially one recently changed in favor of a person now dead." Constable Graves frowned, glancing at the ceiling as though the answer might be written there.
"You think someone burned it?" Miss Marple nodded toward the door. "Shall we have a look at the library together? I suspect the fire there has been very accommodating lately." They moved quietly through the hall, their footsteps muted on the carpet. The library greeted them with its usual hush, a room lined with books, the air still faintly scented of smoke. Miss Marple went straight to the hearth, kneeling delicately despite her age. She lifted the brass fireguard, studying the ash beneath the grate. "There we are," she murmured. "Fine white ash, not from wood. Paper leaves a different sort of residue. Do you see the faint edges here where it curled?" Graves crouched beside her.
"So it's true then. Someone's burned it. I'd say so. And look," she pointed to a small scrap, blackened but still legible enough to reveal the faint loop of a signature. "That was once ink on good parchment." Mrs. Hewitt stood frozen in the doorway, one hand pressed to her throat.
"Who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost tender. "Oh, quite possibly someone who wished to keep peace in the family, or someone who feared what the will might reveal." Graves shut his notebook. "We'll need to ask who was in here last night." Mrs. Hewitt hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the window. "The fire. Margaret tends it most evenings." "She insists I rest." Miss Marple turned slightly.
"Margaret, you say?"
"Yes," Mrs. Hewitt said faintly. "She brought me cocoa before bed and went to check the fire. She's such a thoughtful girl." "Indeed?" Miss Marple murmured, glancing again at the grate. "Thoughtful and perhaps frightened too. I wonder what she thought she was keeping safe." The constable straightened. "So you think Miss Margaret burned the will herself?" Miss Marple brushed the ash gently from her fingers. "I think," she said softly, "that someone asked her to, or she believed it would spare someone she loved." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of the dying embers. Outside, the fog began to thin, revealing a shaft of weak sunlight that touched the window pane. Miss Marple turned from the hearth, her face thoughtful. "Ashes tell stories too, Constable. You need only look closely enough to read them." Graves tucked his notebook away, clearly unsettled. "And what story do these tell, ma'am?" She smiled faintly. "That the dead are not the only ones with secrets, and that the truth, like smoke, never quite stays buried." Chapter 5. The Night Watcher. The moon that night had hung low and swollen, its light filtering through the village lanes like milk poured over glass. By morning that same pale hush seemed to cling to every roof and hedge. The vicar called on Miss Marple just after breakfast, hat in hand.
An uncharacteristic fret on his usually genial brow. "My dear Miss Marple," he began,
lowering his voice as if the walls might be listening. "I thought it best you hear this before the constable does. My niece, young Lily, was quite distraught this morning. She swears she saw someone standing by the Hewitt Manor gate around midnight." Miss Marple looked up from her embroidery, her eyes twinkling with patient interest. "Standing, you say?"
"Not walking."
"Standing quite still," the vicar confirmed. She described the figure as tall, broad-shouldered, she thought, and certainly male. But every man of the household was accounted for. So who could it have been? "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "that is the very question we mustn't answer too quickly." She folded her work neatly, setting it aside. "Tell me, did Lily see anything else?"
"A light, a movement."
The vicar shook his head.
"Only the shape by the gate."
She said it turned toward the manor, as if waiting or watching. Then the clock struck 12 and it was gone. Miss Marple smiled gently. "The clock does tend to frighten away secrets, doesn't it?" By late afternoon, Miss Marple was walking up the lane toward the Hewitt Manor, her parasol tilted against the fading sun. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and wood smoke, and the road was still soft from last night's dew. At the manor gates, she paused, studying the ground. There, near the post, the gravel was disturbed. Not much, a scuff, a faint indentation, as though someone had pivoted quickly in the dark. Closer still, she saw a small, dark thread caught on the iron latch. Wool by the look of it. She smiled to herself and tucked it carefully into her glove. Inside, the house was quieter than usual, heavy with the kind of silence that feels borrowed. Mrs. Hewitt greeted her weakly in the drawing-room, while the daughters sat apart, Clara with her hands folded too tightly, Margaret gazing absently out the window. "Forgive my intrusion," Miss Marple said kindly. "The vicar's niece mentioned something curious last night."
"A figure seen near your gate."
"I wondered if anyone here might have noticed anything amiss." Mrs. Hewitt blinked rapidly. "We were all indoors, I assure you." "The doors locked before 11, Clara nodded stiffly. "The constable has already asked." "None of us left the house." "Of course, dear," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "And yet the gate was unlatched this morning, wasn't it?" "The gardener mentioned it." Margaret turned from the window, her face pale.
It was?" "I didn't notice." "No," Miss Marple said softly, watching her. "Perhaps not." There was a faint tremor in Margaret's hands, just enough to rattle the teacup when she set it down.
Clara reached for it quickly, her voice sharp. "Really, Margaret, you've been jumpy all week," Mrs. Hewitt sighed wearily. "The poor girl hasn't slept."
"None of us have." Miss Marple stood and wandered toward the window.
From there she could see the gate, its hinges rusted, its latch slightly askew. "Tell me," she said almost absently, "is there a back entrance to the house still in use?" "The old servant's door," Mrs. Hewitt replied. "But it hasn't been used in years," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I shouldn't think it's years. Dust has a memory, Mrs. Hewitt. It forgets very quickly when disturbed." She turned then, her eyes soft but unwavering. "The man Lily saw last night was no stranger, I think. It was someone who left the house, briefly, and returned before dawn. A watcher, yes, but not from outside. A quiet ripple passed through the room, like the faintest draught stirring heavy curtains." Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Margaret finally spoke, her voice low. "Why would anyone in this house stand by the gate at midnight?" Miss Marple regarded her gently. "Perhaps because they'd hidden something beyond it, and needed to be certain it stayed hidden." The ticking clock filled the silence. Mrs. Hewitt drew in a trembling breath. "You mean someone we know went out that night?"
"Oh, yes," Miss Marple said softly, gathering her gloves.
"And whoever it was thought darkness would be kind enough to keep their secret. But to watch in darkness, my dear Mrs. Hewitt, is often to hide in it." As she stepped out into the evening, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and candle wax. The gate creaked as she passed, the same gate that had witnessed far too much already. Miss Marple paused and looked back at the manor's shuttered windows, her eyes narrowing slightly. Somewhere inside someone was waiting, hoping their midnight errand had gone unseen. But Miss Marple knew better. The night, after all, had a way of remembering what people wished it would forget. The constable arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just as the clock chimed 4. Outside, the rain had begun in earnest, a soft, unhurried drizzle that seemed to hush the village into thought. Inside, the air was bright with the scent of tea and lemon biscuits. Miss Marple, in her dove-grey cardigan, looked perfectly content as she poured from the pot, her movements neat and unbothered, as though murder were a topic one could discuss between spoonfuls of sugar. "Ah, thank you, Miss Marple," said Constable Graves, easing into the chair opposite. "I must say it's been a dreadful week. Every villager has a theory."
"And not one of them agrees with the next," she smiled politely.
"Oh, I'm quite sure of that, Mr. Graves. In villages, as in life, everyone has their own mystery to solve." She handed him a cup. "You take 2 sugars, don't you?" The constable nodded, then sighed. "We're no closer to finding that butler. If you ask me, Evans took what he could and bolted." Miss Marple stirred her tea delicately.
"Perhaps.
"But I find it rather interesting that a man planning to flee would leave his savings behind, and his Bible." He looked up sharply. "Bible?" "Yes," she said mildly, "open upon a passage about justice. One doesn't usually stop to mark scripture when absconding with silver, wouldn't you say?" The constable hesitated.
"You think he saw something then?"
"That he ran because of fear, not guilt?" "I never think, Mr. Graves," she said gently. "I observe. Which reminds me, did you ever determine what that metallic trace was?" "The one found inside the pumpkin." Graves frowned.
Funny thing that.
"The lab said it was silver alloy, possibly jewellery. But we've nothing missing of that kind." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not missing, perhaps. Misunderstood." He blinked.
"Come again?"
She rose, moving to a small cabinet by the hearth where she kept her needlework and, more often than not, small mysteries she preferred to ponder in peace. From it, she withdrew a handkerchief-wrapped bundle and placed it on the table. "I had a look at the remains of that pumpkin, you know, before it was thrown out. You might say curiosity got the better of me." Unfolding the cloth, she revealed a small, curved fragment of polished metal, tarnished at one edge. "This, I believe, was part of a cuff-link." The constable leaned forward, brow furrowing.
"A cuff-link? You're certain?" "Oh, quite."
"My late nephew had a pair much like it. Rather fashionable some years ago, engraved with a small crest, see? This one bears a letter E. Now tell me, who in your reports bears a name beginning so?" He sat back slowly.
"Evans, the butler." "Indeed." She replaced the fragment gently.
"Now it might seem conclusive. Our missing man leaves behind his mark near the scene of the crime. But then again, the obvious answer is so often the wrong one." Graves rubbed his chin. "So he wasn't the killer?" Miss Marple's tone softened, almost sympathetic.
"No, Miss Graves, I rather think he saw the killer."
And perhaps the killer saw him. The rain ticked against the window panes, steady and thoughtful. Graves frowned, his eyes drifting toward the hearth as though the answer might be tucked behind the logs.
"If Evans witnessed something, why run instead of telling her?"
She looked into her teacup, her voice quiet but sure. "Because he was loyal, Mr. Graves, and loyalty, like guilt, can make a man behave in peculiar ways." He sighed.
"Then what do we do?"
Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling like a lantern in fog. "We wait. The truth, you see, always grows restless when left alone. And when it stirs, it tends to knock on the door of those who thought themselves safe." Graves chuckled nervously. "You make it sound almost certain." "Oh, it is," she replied, standing to refill the pot. "The clue everyone saw, but no one understood, is already telling us its story. We need only listen." As the constable departed, the rain eased, leaving behind a soft, glistening hush. Miss Marple stood at her window watching the last drops slide down the glass. Somewhere out there, a frightened man was hiding, and a murderer believed himself clever. She smiled faintly. Neither, she thought, would stay hidden for long. Chapter 6. A Letter in the Bible. The butler's cottage sat on the edge of the manor grounds, small and tidy, its windows half-shuttered against the morning chill. The air smelled of damp stone and old soap, an honest scent, Miss Marple thought, belonging to a man who took pride in keeping things as they should be. She entered quietly, escorted by Constable Graves, who seemed a little uncertain about what they expected to find. "Mind your step, Miss Marple," he said, as they crossed the threshold. Nothing much here but dust and a few books, she smiled faintly. Ah, Mr. Graves, it's the few books that often hold the most. The room was neatly ordered, bed tucked tight, shoes polished and lined beneath a chair. On the small table lay an oil lamp, a worn comb, and a copy of the good book, its cover softened by years of handling. Miss Marple moved toward it almost instinctively, the way one might reach for a memory. The Bible was open, though she noticed, curiously not on the desk as if read recently, but placed squarely at the center of the pillow as if set down with meaning. Turning a few pages, she found one corner faintly creased. There, tucked just beyond the thin paper, was a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly, the handwriting neat, deliberate. "Mr. Graves," she said softly, "would you mind very much if I borrowed your penknife?" He handed it over without question, and with a careful slice the wax seal broke. Inside lay a letter, written in an unsteady hand that wavered between courage and fear. She unfolded it on the desk, smoothing the creases with gentle fingers. The constable leaned over. "Whose writing is that?"
"Evans's," she said quietly.
He had a good hand for a man of service. Her eyes moved along the words, her expression softening, then tightening slightly as she read aloud. "To whom it may concern, or perhaps only to myself, Mr. Thomas Hewitt is not the man his mother believes him to be. He found letters, old ones, concerning an inheritance that should never have been his. He has used those letters to threaten the family, to demand silence in exchange for money and name. Mrs. Hewitt does not know the half of it. I have seen what this has done to the girls, especially Miss Margaret. She bears it too quietly.
I mean to tell her mother tonight, before more harm is."
I trust in the Lord for justice, whatever it may cost." When she finished, silence filled the room. The constable drew a long breath. "So Evans knew Tom was blackmailing them?" "It would seem so," Miss Marple said, her voice tinged with sadness. "And that he meant to act. He must have gone to the house that night." Graves frowned. "Then why didn't he tell us this sooner?" "Perhaps," she said gently, "because he never got the chance." She turned the page of the Bible to where the letter had rested. The passage was marked in pencil, "The truth shall make you free." Miss Marple traced the words with one gloved fingertip. "You see, Mr. Graves, Evans wasn't running from guilt. He was running from danger. I suspect he saw something that made him realize justice that night had more than one hand." The constable looked puzzled. "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said quietly, "that someone else sought to stop Tom Hewitt as well, someone who believed their own reasons were righteous." Through the cottage window, the light shifted, falling across the small, plain room. A few personal keepsakes sat upon a shelf, an old photograph, a watch, a pressed flower. It all spoke of a man who lived simply, loyally, and perhaps too trustingly. Miss Marple folded the letter back into its envelope and replaced it between the pages. "We'll leave it here for now. The dead deserve their truths to rest where they chose to keep them." As they stepped outside, the wind stirred the trees, scattering a few brittle leaves across the path. Graves tucked his notebook away, still frowning. "So you think Evans tried to save Mrs. Hewitt, not harm her?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, but justice is rarely tidy, Mr. Graves, and those who reach for it often find themselves standing closer to the edge than they realize." The constable gave a low whistle. "Then someone else finished what Evans began, or feared he might," she murmured. "And in that fear did something they thought would never be found out." She turned once more toward the little cottage, the curtains shifting slightly in the breeze,
as though the house itself were breathing a sigh. "Justice, it seems," she said softly, almost to herself,
"had more than one hand that night." Evening descended gently over the Hewitt Manor, wrapping its chimneys and windows in a haze of pale smoke. Inside, the fire in the library crackled low and steady, the scent of burning pine lingering in the air. Chairs had been drawn near the hearth, and one by one the Hewitt family gathered at Miss Marple's quiet request. Mrs. Hewitt sat nearest the fire, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Clara stood by the mantel, her expression proud but brittle, while Margaret lingered in the shadows by the window, her face pale and unreadable. Constable Graves stood discreetly by the door, notebook closed for once. Miss Marple, in her neat hat and shawl, took her place by the fire. The flames painted soft amber lines across her face as she began, her voice calm, almost conversational. "Thank you for humouring an old woman's curiosity."
I thought it best to speak plainly, here, where it all began. No one answered.
Only the clock on the mantel ticked, a soft metronome of unease. Miss Marple clasped her hands. "Let us begin, shall we? Mr. Thomas Hewitt was found dead in this very room, beside a candle moved from its place, a decanter half wiped, and a single glove upon the floor. At first glance, one might think it a struggle, but there were no signs of violence." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. Then came the pumpkin, a childish curiosity, one might say, smashed near the window, its contents peculiar, a trace of metal inside. That small fragment, I later discovered, belonged to a cufflink belonging to Mr. Evans, your butler. Clara's voice trembled slightly. "So he was here that night?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said gently, "but not for theft. He came because he could no longer bear what he knew. He meant to tell Mrs. Hewitt the truth about Tom's blackmail, the letters he used to frighten you all." Mrs. Hewitt gasped softly, a hand at her throat. "Blackmail?"
My son, surely not.
"I'm afraid so," Miss Marple said, her voice low but firm. "Evans left a letter in his Bible explaining everything. He sought to protect you, Mrs. Hewitt, but I fear he never had the chance." Margaret's fingers tightened around the back of her chair. "You mean
He saw the murderer?"
Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed. But the person he saw was not a stranger." The fire crackled, a log shifting with a hiss of sparks. She turned slightly, looking toward the grate. "Now about the will. Constable Graves discovered it had been burned, accidentally, or so it was believed. But I suspect otherwise. The will was changed recently, wasn't it?" Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. Mother wished to divide things fairly. Tom disagreed. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "He stood to gain less than he expected. But someone else, someone with much to lose, decided the will itself was too dangerous to exist." She nodded toward the fireplace. "That frame above the mantel once held the original."
"Its ashes lie there now, though I dare say they've grown cold." Mrs. Hewitt's eyes glistened.
"And then the killer burned it?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady, unhurried. "The will was burned by mistake," she said softly, "but the killer's intent was not." A silence fell so deep that even the clock seemed to hesitate. Margaret took a step forward, her voice fragile.
Why would you say that?"
Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but her words carried a quiet weight, because whoever killed Tom did so not out of greed, but out of mercy. Someone who had suffered under his cruelty, who knew the shame he'd buried beneath family pride. Someone who feared exposure more than punishment. Margaret's breath caught her eyes glistening. Clara turned sharply toward her, realization dawning, but Miss Marple lifted a hand. "Not yet, Miss Clara. The truth, you see, has its own pace. It knocks softly, and guilt always opens the door." No one spoke. The fire whispered on, its flames bending low as though listening. Finally, Miss Marple folded her hands, her expression as calm as ever. "All that remains is to decide who answered that knock." Her words lingered in the air, soft but unyielding, as though the room itself were waiting for confession. Chapter 7. The True Killer Revealed. The room seemed to shrink around the hearth as Miss Marple's words settled into silence. The fire gave a low pop, and a flake of ash drifted upward, turning to nothing in the air. Outside, the wind sighed against the window panes.
As if the night itself were. Margaret stood very still by the window.
Her pale face turned toward the flames, her hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles blanched. Clara shifted uneasily beside their mother, her chin raised in a mask of defiance that couldn't quite hide her trembling. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was gentle. "I dare say the truth is rarely crueler than the lies meant to protect it. And yet, my dear Margaret, it is you we must speak of now. Margaret's head snapped up.
Me? Her voice was faint, incredulous.
But please, Miss Marple said kindly, don't distress yourself with denial. You've carried this burden alone long enough. Clara turned sharply toward her sister.
What nonsense is this?
You can't possibly believe— Miss Marple lifted a hand, her expression calm but commanding.
I believe, Miss Clara, that Margaret did not plan a murder.
She planned a plea. The constable straightened but made no move to speak. Miss Marple's tone softened as she continued. Tom discovered the forgery, didn't he? Your mother's will, redrafted by loving hands to protect what little remained after your father's debts. It was an act of desperation, not greed. But to Tom, it was opportunity. He threatened to expose it, to destroy your mother's name unless Margaret persuaded her to give him everything he wanted. Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came. Her shoulders shook once, almost imperceptibly. Tom called her to the library that night. Miss Marple went on quietly. He had the original document in hand, ready to use it against her. Margaret brought the silver candlestick from the sideboard. Oh, not as a weapon. She meant only to frighten him, to make him see reason. But when he struck her— Mrs. Hewitt gasped, covering her mouth with her handkerchief. Clara's eyes widened in horror. When he struck her, Miss Marple said softly, her hand lifted in fear, not fury. He fell backward, struck his head upon the marble hearth, and the candlestick slipped from her grasp. The fire hissed softly.
A faint echo of the moment Miss Marple described. Evans came upon the scene moments later, she continued.
He saw what had happened and he understood. Margaret begged him not to tell. He promised to protect her, to see the truth safely hidden. He moved the candlestick, wiped the decanter she had touched, and told her to go upstairs at once. Constable Graves shifted uncomfortably.
And then?
Then, said Miss Marple, he returned to the library to pray. He must have thought to tell the constable in the morning, to confess it all properly. But before dawn he realized the evidence. The will might still betray her. He burned it, meaning to spare her. In that he sealed his own disappearance. Margaret's breath came in shallow bursts.
He was so kind, she whispered. I never meant— Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes kind but unwavering.
No, my dear, you never meant to kill him. But intention and consequence are rarely good friends. A crime born of love is still a crime. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. He was cruel, Miss Marple. You can't know how cruel. The things he said to Mother, the way he threatened us. I know, Miss Marple said softly. And I know, too, that you will find no peace in silence. The truth has waited long enough. Clara rose, anger flashing in her voice.
You can't let them take her.
She did it for all of us. Mrs. Hewitt reached for her daughter's hand, her own trembling.
Hush, Clara, she whispered.
The truth is kinder than the lie. Miss Marple turned to the constable. Mr. Graves, you'll find the candlestick in the garden shed, beneath the loose boards by the back door. She placed it there the morning after. Graves nodded grimly, tipping his hat. I'll see to it.
Ma'am? Margaret sank into the nearest chair, weeping softly.
While Miss Marple placed a hand on her shoulder, a touch of compassion, more than judgment. When you tell your story, she said gently, tell it plainly. People forgive more easily when they understand why. The fire had burned low, its last embers glowing faintly in the grate. The truth, long stifled, had finally spoken. And though it had broken hearts, it had also lifted a weight that none of them could bear any longer. The room felt heavier after the confession, as though every breath hung suspended between guilt and relief. The fire had dwindled to soft embers, its glow flickering faintly across Margaret's tear-streaked face. She sat motionless in the armchair, hands clasped in her lap, her knuckles white against the dark fabric of her dress. Constable Graves cleared his throat quietly, cap in hand. "Miss Margaret," he began, voice thick with discomfort, "I'll need you to come along with me now." Margaret looked up at him, eyes wide, but oddly calm, as if some inner battle had already been fought and lost.
"Yes," she whispered. "I know." Mrs. Hewitt gave a strangled sob rising from her chair. "No, please, she's just a girl."
"She didn't mean to—" Miss Marple turned to her gently. No harm will come to her tonight, Mrs. Hewitt. The constable will see that she's treated fairly. It is not cruelty that waits for her, but mercy earned by truth." The constable hesitated, glancing toward Miss Marple for guidance, and she nodded faintly. Understanding passed between them. This was no hardened criminal, only a soul caught in the snare of her own fear. Margaret stood, unsteady at first, and Graves stepped forward to support her arm. His large, work-roughened hand enveloped hers with surprising care. "We'll walk slow," he murmured. "No need to hurry." She gave a small nod, her voice trembling.
"Thank you." Mrs. Hewitt's cries softened into quiet weeping.
Clara clung to her mother, her earlier defiance broken. Miss Marple moved toward them, her small frame graceful and sure, her tone steady as she spoke. "Your daughter has suffered greatly," she said softly, "but she will not be alone. The truth, painful as it is, has set things right at last, and in time forgiveness may yet find its way home." Mrs. Hewitt raised her eyes, full of gratitude, through the tears.
"You've been our salvation, Miss Marple," she whispered.
"Without you, we should have lived in lies forever." Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "I'm an old woman, my dear, and I've learned that lies, like damp in a cottage wall, have a way of spreading until the whole house gives way. Better a cracked stone honestly mended than a wall built on deceit." Outside, the night was hushed. The constable's lantern cast a dim path through the mist as he led Margaret toward the lane. The faint crunch of their footsteps on the gravel faded slowly, swallowed by the quiet. Within the manor, Mrs. Hewitt and Clara sat close together by the dying fire. The house, stripped of its secrets, seemed to breathe again, a long, shuddering sigh of relief. Miss Marple, standing by the window, looked out into the fog. "How strange," she murmured, "that even the wind sounds gentler now." Clara turned toward her, eyes red from weeping. "Will people talk, Miss Marple? You know how they are." "Oh, they'll talk," Miss Marple said with a faint chuckle, "but not unkindly. Our villagers understand tragedy more than they pretend to, and by next spring there'll be new gossip, new cakes to judge, new roses to prune. Life goes on, my dear." A quiet smile flickered on Clara's lips.
"You make it sound almost bearable." "Time," Miss Marple replied, fastening her shawl.
"And truth, once it's out, tends to mend what it's broken, if given a little kindness." She stepped toward the door, pausing briefly to glance back at the two women. "See to your mother, Miss Clara, and remember, forgiveness often begins at one's own hearth." The hall clock struck midnight as Miss Marple stepped out into the lane. The mist curled around her like an old friend. In the distance, the faint beam of the constable's lantern shimmered briefly, then disappeared around the bend. Miss Marple took a slow breath of the cool air, her breath clouding faintly before her. "Poor child," she murmured, "but peace at last." The village of St. Mary Mead slept on, roofs glistening faintly with dew. Somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. The world, cleansed of its shadows, seemed to rest easier. For even on Halloween, when ghosts and guilt alike walk abroad, truth has its own kind of light, soft, steady, and endlessly forgiving. Chapter 8. The Morning After Truth. The morning after truth broke over St. Mary Mead like pale gold spilled across the rooftops. A low mist lingered above the hedgerows, softening the world as if the village itself wished to forget the chill of the previous nights. In her garden, Miss Marple knelt among the last of the chrysanthemums, trimming their stems with delicate precision. The air smelled faintly of damp soil and fallen leaves, an earthy scent of closure. From the church tower came the slow toll of the 9 o'clock bell. Each note drifted through the quiet lanes, measured and tender, as though blessing the morning. Miss Marple straightened, brushing a bit of soil from her glove, and smiled faintly. Bells, she thought, had a way of making even sorrow sound holy. On her small wrought-iron table lay the morning paper, folded neatly beside her teacup. The headline, printed in thick black type, read, "Tragic Family Incident Solved. Local Woman Confesses." Beneath it, the article spoke of a regrettable domestic altercation, the swift work of the constabulary, and the keen assistance of a respected village resident, Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the words drift past her mind like smoke. Reporters, she mused, were fond of tidiness in their tales, tragedy boxed up neatly, grief packaged for public comfort. But she had seen the faces, heard the tremor in Margaret's voice, the mother's sob that had carried through the long night. Truth was never tidy. It left edges frayed and uneven. A robin hopped along the edge of her path, head cocked as if in polite inquiry.
"Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "It's all quite over now." The bird fluttered away toward the hedgerow,
vanishing into the golden tangle of autumn leaves. From across the lane came the familiar sound of Mrs. Bantry's bicycle bell, followed by her cheerful voice. "Good morning, Jane."
"I suppose you've read the dreadful thing in the paper."
Miss Marple looked up, shading her eyes from the soft sun. "Indeed I have, Dolly, though I dare say the paper's version is rather more dramatic than the truth." Mrs. Bantry dismounted, her coat bright against the morning grey.
"I can't think how you keep so calm through."
Poor Mrs. Hewitt.
"I should have fainted dead away if such a thing had happened in my house." "You'd have managed splendidly," Miss Marple replied with a kind smile.
"Women always do when they must." They spoke quietly for a while, about the weather, the late bloom of the dahlias, the vicar's sermon next Sunday. But beneath their words ran that undercurrent that always follows tragedy in small villages, sympathy mingled with curiosity, compassion laced with just a touch of speculation. When Mrs. Bantry finally cycled off, the lane fell silent again except for the rustle of the wind through the trees. Miss Marple returned to her pruning, her thoughts drifting. It was curious, she reflected, how peace often arrived wearing sorrow's cloak. The Hewitts' home would never quite be the same, yet perhaps, in time, it would grow gentler. Broken things often did, once mended with truth. She paused to admire a single white rose, still clinging to its stem, fragile yet stubborn against the coming frost. "You're late to bloom," she murmured, "but that's no fault in itself." Her gaze lifted toward the horizon, where the last of the mist was rising. Life went on, carriages rolling past, postmen whistling, children calling to one another from the green. The world resumed its rhythm as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, and perhaps that was its quiet mercy. She carried her tools back to the shed, pausing by the gate. In the stillness of her garden, her voice was barely above a whisper. "We all wear masks," she said, eyes on the drifting leaves. "Some just crack sooner than others." The church bells began again, softer this time, echoing through the crisp air. Miss Marple smiled faintly, lifting her teacup one last time to the morning. Peace, she thought, was never without its shadows, but even shadows in good light could look like grace. The afternoon drew in softly, bringing with it the faintest murmur of rain against the window-pane. Miss Marple sat once more by the hearth in the vicarage, the fire burning low but steady, its glow casting gentle amber halos upon the lace curtains. Opposite her, Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife, poured out the second pot of tea, a fragrant Darjeeling, light and floral, the kind Miss Marple always said made one think kindly of the world. The clink of china, the slow pour of liquid, the soft crackle of fire, these were the sounds that had returned to St. Mary Mead after the week's grim excitement. Outside, the village roofs wore a sheen of silver under the drizzle, and somewhere in the distance a cart rumbled down the lane. Its wheels murmuring like an old lullaby, Mrs. Weatherby sighed, her knitting needles pausing mid-stitch. "I can't quite believe it's finished, Jane. Poor Margaret, such a gentle girl. And to think all this time—" Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Yes, my dear. It is a terrible thing to lose one's temper when one's heart is already breaking. People imagine wickedness comes in dark forms with cruelty or greed, but more often it slips in wearing sorrow's face." The vicar's wife looked at her over the rim of her cup. "You think she'll ever forgive herself?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, though her eyes softened with something like pity. "Forgiveness, Mrs. Weatherby, is a long road. It begins not with forgetting, but with understanding why one stumbled in the first place. The rain thickened slightly, pattering in rhythmic comfort. A clock somewhere ticked gently, marking time's patient passage. After a thoughtful pause, Miss Marple continued, "It's not the wickedness that shocks me, you know. People have always done dreadful things. What troubles me is how often it hides beneath kindness. We are all so eager to be thought good, we forget that goodness requires more than smiling manners and polite words." Mrs. Weatherby stirred her tea, her face thoughtful. "You always see deeper than the rest of us, Jane. I sometimes think the village would fall into complete moral disrepair if you ever decided to leave." Miss Marple chuckled softly, the sound like the turning of delicate pages. "Oh, I doubt that. The village has a way of mending itself. A little gossip, a little gardening, and a good bake sale or two, most troubles shrink after that." They both laughed quietly, as if afraid to disturb the peace that had settled around them. Outside, the church bell rang the half-hour. For a while, neither spoke. The fire sighed. A coal shifted with a gentle hiss. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the rain, tracing its silvery paths down the glass. Her thoughts wandered, not to the Hewetts or even to Margaret, but to the quiet constancy of life itself. How it carried on, indifferent yet compassionate, washing away the sharp edges of tragedy until only its lessons remained. "Do you ever tire of mysteries?" Mrs. Weatherby asked suddenly, watching her with fond curiosity. Miss Marple smiled again, eyes bright beneath the soft lamplight.
Not at all."
"Every mystery is simply human nature in disguise, and one mustn't grow tired of people, for all their curious ways. They make the world such an endlessly interesting place." The kettle whistled faintly from the stove. Mrs. Weatherby rose to refill their cups, and Miss Marple leaned back, the warmth of the fire curling around her like an old friend. "Still," she murmured,
almost to herself, "the village keeps its peace."
Until the next whisper. The rain answered with its gentle applause, and the firelight flickered across her thoughtful face. Somewhere beyond the hedges, the church bell fell silent, leaving only the hush of the storm and the comforting clink of teacups in its place. Until next time, dear listener, keep your fire warm and your curiosity warmer still.